Hi, my name's Shiraz Bayjoo. I'm an artist based here in London and Mauritius, where I'm from. My work explores themes of post-coloniality and the legacies of European colonialism on identity and nationhood. And I work between painting, photography, film, and this often comes together in the form of installation.
Welcome to the National Gallery. My name is Daniel Herman. I'm the curator of modern and contemporary projects here at the National Gallery. And of course, the National Gallery does not collect modern and contemporary art, but we've always worked with artists that are alive, artists that are makers, artists that are practitioners and making artworks. And a majority of these works in our building here have inspired artists to make new work, have inspired artists to discuss work, to argue about work, to ask questions about work. And what we are very delighted to have you here for today is the first in our new series of lectures, talks, discussions, Unexpected Views. What we're doing is actually a fairly simple project. We want to invite some of the most interesting artists today to talk about the works of art in the National Gallery that are relevant and of interest to them. That means these are not talks that are just about a painting. These are not talks that talk about, let's say in this case, Mr. Turner or the Temeraire as an expert to talk about this particular painting, but it's an opportunity for us to be in conversation with an artist, to hear a very subjective take of a contemporary practitioner of how these particular works are of interest, relevance, and importance to artists today. And in that respect, I'm particularly delighted to introduce you to Shiraz Bayjoo, our artist who is going to talk with us about the Fighting Temeraire today. Shiraz is an artist whom I have known for several years, whose work I first came across when I was a curator at the Whitechapel Gallery here in London, when he was invited to work with youth groups in the area, but also to show his work in the context of East London, of the Whitechapel Gallery. Shiraz was born in Mauritius. He is a multidisciplinary artist who really works with film, with painting, with photography, with performance, and with installation. His research-based practice that takes into account histories, that takes into account archives, that takes into account social interactions, really focuses on personal and public archives and addresses cultural memory, post-colonial nationhood, and the ways that we represent these things through institutions, through interactions, and also in visual art so far. Shiraz studied at the University of Wales Institute in Cardiff. He was artist in residence at the Whitechapel Gallery in 2011, has exhibited with Tate Britain at the Institute of International Visual Arts, INEVA, as a recipient of the Gasworks Fellowship in the UK, and has most recently exhibited at several exhibitions, including the 14th Biennial in Sharjah, the 4th Biennial of Casablanca in Morocco. You will know some of his work from the 154 Art Fair, which will also start again next month, of course. To me, Shiraz's work is really extremely poignant and fascinating for the way that it addresses difficult histories, difficult ways of how not just individuals and artists, but also institutions deal with this history. And Shiraz uses forms of history, forms of the form language of art history to address these topics. Before I keep on talking now, please welcome Shiraz Bayjoo. I think the way we would like to do these talks is very, very informally. We would like to talk about a painting and how it influences an artist for roughly, let's say, 30 minutes. And then afterwards, we'll have the opportunity for questions and answers from the audience. Again, we want to make it informal, so hopefully it'll work out. But that will be dependent on you asking lots of questions afterwards. So let's see if we can make that work. Shiraz, maybe just to start right in medias res, how did you choose this painting, and why did you find this painting relevant to talk about at the moment?
Sure. Well, hey everybody. Looking at Turner's work is something that I often do, and it's something that I do a lot with my students because of the way that Turner uses light. And when I was a student myself, when I was learning to paint, The day that I figured out that actually to be able to paint light rather than trying to paint physical objects or physicality in painting, that was when I started to kind of crack the nut, when I started to sort of understand how language, how you take something that is 3D, that is spatial, and you translate it into something that is two-dimensional. And Turner is a really incredible artist in being able to translate that for us. And he works in a period that is kind of lays the ground for modernist painting, kind of lays the ground for abstraction. And for that, I think he sits in a really special and unique place. And he's a very British painter as well, with not necessarily a huge number of notable painters within that period either. So in that sense, he has been massively influential in my work, and it sort of felt like it was quite the right artist to talk about in the context here. And why this painting? Well, there are several of Turner's paintings in this museum, in this gallery, and some of them are a lot more abstract and perhaps sit closer to what I was just describing. Sorry, some people can't hear over here. But for sure, this work perhaps sits historically in a very interesting place, and a very interesting place in terms of where museums and institutions right now are looking, and the way that we are reassessing the context in which many artists have worked previously. And in this sense, then I think this is quite an important painting, and also quite a gentle place to start that conversation as well.
Do you remember the first time that you encountered the painting? Do you have a moment where you actually recollect seeing this object for the first time?
I mean, being very lucky to have gone to school in the south of England, we often came to the National Gallery, school children, secondary school children, and it would have been in one of those very early years that I remember seeing this painting, and seeing, a lot of the great works that sit around us now. Yeah.
Is it different when you see that a painting like this? In this nascent moment of, okay, I'm becoming conscious of artworks, of art as a thing that's around, and then seeing it again when you come to it as an artist with, oh, now I'm an art student, now I actually want to be an artist myself. Is that a different way that you look at a painting like that?
Yeah, definitely. I think there are a lot of works, a lot of artists that perhaps we are particularly drawn to when we're younger, and and the rooms are are filled with some quite extraordinary language. But coming back to Turner in my 20s, you see, like I said before, the way that he works with light. And I remember very early on when I was quite young, always being quite sort of struck about how the works were so abstract, and they sat in a room with works that were so distinctly not in that vein of language. So in that sense, they've always stood out, I think, very early on. But definitely, as you work into the kind of language, the kind of practice that you want to develop as an artist, there's this kind of reoccurring relevance of his work, as opposed to others, I think. Even others, for example, even the stubs behind us, that make very big stylistic stamps, but don't necessarily maintain their relevance as to why you would reference them.
In that case, maybe looking at the Temeraire and the painting, when you approach it again with your particular interest and your subjective interests in art, what are the things that immediately stand out? What are the things that draw your attention formally, then maybe historically, and then maybe emotionally?
I mean, well, for sure, 2/3 of this painting is the sky. And that is one of the things that Turner was so fantastic at doing, and being able to actually turn seascapes, landscapes, the elements of the environment around us, turn that into an actual genre, and actually turn it into an exciting one. And he does that by the very thing that you're describing us, is actually by loading it with emotion. The colors are not necessarily the colors that we would really be seeing. They have been dramatized. I mean, this entire painting, and when you actually know the history behind it, is a complete fabrication in lots of ways and on lots of levels. And that is the whole point of what Turner tries to do. He tries to drive us emotionally along lines that shift our position in relation to perhaps a story we know. And that's what's quite important, one of the reasons I choose this, because at the time this was a story that people were was very relevant in the psyche of people at the time. The Temeraire was a very famous ship, and one that was particularly beloved by the nation at the time. Yeah.
Shall we maybe quickly reiterate that story of what we're seeing in that painting? Do you want?
Yes, yeah, sure. Well, the Temeraire was famous for, in a short version, for kind of saving Nelson's flagship victory in the Battle of Trafalgar, and had become infamous with the story. It had become a huge part of British nostalgia of that period, of the Navy, and its retirement at the time when it was broken down in the breaker's yard. I think, as I believe, that from the sources we've read, say that people came to see it. People came to see this ship being taken apart, and it was in the papers at the time. It was quite a thing. I mean, to the point where I think in 2005 it was voted Britain's favourite painting. And it's going to be on a new banknote?
That's correct, actually. As we're in the moment of changing over currency to different kind of tactilities and fabrics, the Fighting Temeraire will actually be on the back of the 20 pound note. So this has become such iconic a picture and so beloved a painting that it has been endorsed and accepted as becoming part of our everyday currency. Well, those of us who regularly deal with 20 pound notes, I guess. Not sure how popular that is. But yeah, that's interesting. And that's, there's also a certain symbolism, of course, in an old sailing vessel being broken down and in Turner's painting, being dragged to the shipbreaker's yard by a steamship, and then this encroaching of industry and the representation of this conflict becomes a very, very important part of the painting.
Yeah, and some people have described this as being a certain nostalgia, this nostalgia of the end of the sailing world, the end of empire perhaps. But then there are also other arguments about this work. I mean, for example, that the scene that we see, the sun is setting in the wrong place, for example. So it's in that sense, it is a completely fabricated piece. And you know, the way that the steamboat has been placed into focus, the sailboat is, to a certain degree, it is glowing in a kind of nostalgic sort of ghostly presence. But the tugboat is very much about the present. It's about
and it's a question if this is a sunset or a sundawn.
Yes, exactly. So there are, you know, is this a transition of a new age? I mean, we spoke briefly about this before, Daniel, and we spoke about a painting that would have influenced Turner when he painted the Battle of Trafalgar, which he was commissioned to paint by the King, I think at the time, is that right? Something along those lines. And it was the painting Medusa by Géricault, which is a painting of a scene of being shipwrecked, being lost at sea on a raft, and it's a scene that sort of touches upon the violence of seafaring and has potential perhaps cannibalism, but certainly it presents death in a very graphic way. And at the time, I mean, it's a very classical painting from our eyes today, but at the time it would have been quite shocking to audiences. And Turner saw this, and he references that composition in his Battle of Trafalgar painting. So he definitely isn't heroizing, you know, war and the Battle of Trafalgar and those huge heights of British naval success. He isn't glamorizing them in a way that we would necessarily have expected. So then it kind of places this painting, which he paints about 15 years later, into a slightly different light, I think. And the reason why I'm telling you all of this is because this is the kind of thing that I look at behind symbolisms, behind layers of history, that allow us to perhaps reposition the symbols and the objects and the things that we work with.
So just in terms of process, for your own work, you work with an interest in history, you look at how we have represented events, values, institutions throughout history, and how these traditions of representing them have been informed, have changed over the years. So when you have a painting like this, you've encountered it in your youth, you've encountered it in your bringing up as an artist, in your education, and in your practice as an artist now, in the way that you work. How would you encounter such a work? How would you go about, well, the term of influence is a very, very difficult one. But how would you go about, okay, now my interest is piqued as an artist. What do you do when you see this work?
I think, well, first of all, we always want to understand the audience, the arguments that sit around any subject, right? So we want to understand as far as we can go 360 degrees around a subject, looking at the arguments for and counter to a piece of work. But then, you know, looking at what are the symbolisms, what are the things that we use to describe ourselves, what are the things that are in popular culture, and to perhaps to start to try and unpick that. Sorry, if I can't speak any louder, if I'm not reaching you at the back, apologize. And I think, which is what again is quite interesting about how Turner has constructed this and how he uses this symbolism and he layers it behind. In my own work, I work a lot with photography, with archive images, and I place those into paintings that are very abstract, but they are very much about emotion. And they are about creating an emotional space within which to reposition this image or icon or symbol that we may well be something that we're quite familiar with, but how we reposition that and understand our relationship to it today. And in that sense, you can kind of start to understand how some of these more historical works are constructed. Yeah, if that makes sense.
So looking at the way that Turner does that and that he uses things like composition, color, and brushwork, for instance, what are the things that immediately spoke to you or have maybe even surprised you, even though you've encountered this work before, but that continue to surprise and entice you? Are there particular things that stick out?
I think the layering, the layering of colors, of being able to create emotional movement within the work. So you go from one corner of the painting to another and it shifts. It shifts in the way that you read it, in the way that you feel. You know, we are taught in art school to look at the lines of where the audience will, how the audience will read a painting. You will move from a central point to an outer point, you might move round, but we can also read things very much in relation to how they make us feel. And this is ultimately, I mean, this is what abstraction and what a lot of modernism was about. But I think here in this work, I think Turner is playing around with those notions. And what does strike me though, when I saw this work again recently, is how thick it has been painted in a very simplistic way, how it has been layered and how the palette work, how the palette knife has been used so loosely. It was actually a lot in contrast to how I remembered it and how I remember a lot of Turner's works and actually a lot of works that this has influenced of that period.
I find that very fascinating. I think a lot of times, because Turner is one of those artists who is extremely often reproduced. I mean, it will be reproduced on a 20-pound note. So what we think of when we think of Turner is very often Turner reproduction. It's the image of a Turner. But there's a strong physicality to a Turner painting. There's a strong moment of actually engaging with paint in a very physical, haptic, material way. This is not just an image, it is stuff. It's stuff layered on a canvas. And that stuff in this time when the Temeraire was painted in the 1940s is at a time when industrialization is taking forward. Chemical development is going forward. We have new things being invented, and I think what I find very fascinating from an art historical point of view is how Turner does not only use images, iconography, symbolism, things we can see as a conduit for meaning. There's not just a ship, another ship, a sunset, and a seascape. Those all are images that convey meaning. But he also uses the material itself as a conduit for meaning. The application of paint in the sunset becomes all of a sudden an emotional conduit. It becomes also a certain discourse about painting and the power of painting itself. I'm not sure if you would agree with that.
No, absolutely. And I think then when we start to break it down on this level, and we start to then think about how, you know, why are we deliberately choosing this ship? Why are we deliberately placing this ship into this ghostly position? Why are we presenting and presenting in black, which is also quite rare at this period to be using black pigment. The tugboat, which is something that he painted and sketched hundreds of at this point. And as you mentioned the other day, Daniel, also that he chooses not to place this behind one of the scenes along the river, which would have been, you know, for example, St. Paul's Cathedral, or somewhere that would have really shown the height of the power of empire as it sat. He actually chooses to present this in the estuary towards the end where the breakers' yards are. And also it presents a scene where, you know, actually the river would have been full of a lot more traffic than this as well. So he is deliberately constructing all of this, you know, as one does at this period of painting, as one does with painting today. But then when we start to look at why he's choosing to use those modes and why these symbols and why in these ways, we can also see then a parallel to how artists work today and how we take contemporary images and how we rework them.
You mentioned Shiraz, that you also look at this painting with your students.
Yeah.
How do your students react to a painting like that? What are the things that they pick up on immediately, and how has that maybe changed for students in 2019 to students from an earlier time?
Yeah. Well, I think at first they say, well, this isn't an abstract painting because this is how I introduce it. I say we're going to look at language in painting, emotional language in painting. We're going to understand how we can read it. And I think at first folks say to me, well, this is a pretty obvious, this is a literal painting, there's a painting of a scene, there's a painting of a ship. And so then we start to say, well, actually, let's break down the language, as we're doing now. Let's break down the language of what we're really seeing and start to question why we are seeing things in the way that we are. Why these colors, why this lightness, or why this solidness, perhaps, you know, this weight that are in certain aspects of the painting. And that starts to then allow us to open up and start to think about how to have the confidence actually to be able to approach how we look at artworks. That's something that's quite important. I think Turner is quite unique in being able to use in the way that he's able to bridge that gap. In relation to how we might have looked at it before, I don't know actually. I'm not so sure about that.
Yeah, I just wonder if there's particular questions that students have about an artist like Turner nowadays that they wouldn't have had 10 years ago, 5 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, certainly the film that was made about his life recently might have shifted that. But I think certainly for young students today, I think a lot of them would instantly look at this and think, well, this might be a bit boring. What is this about? This is about a story that isn't relevant to us today or now. But then when we start to question the language that's within it, and we start to be able to read that language, then perhaps we start to be able to relate to the mind of another person and how they are connecting, feeling, seeing that space.
I find it quite interesting from the gallery's point of view, and again from my point of view as an art historian, the kind of questions that members of the public come to us with. And I bet my colleagues from the education department would have far more and more relevant things to say than I could, but I do find that there's a particular interest with Turner at the moment, for instance, in terms of economic history, in terms of social history, so that we're looking at a Turner not just as a genius painter, which is of course the trope that a lot of films are presenting to us, and that's the narrative that very often gets rolled out, but also an artist who was very, very much rooted in a moment in time, social networks, and a moment of industrial and economic history that was dealing with really pivotal changes in the society and the world. And I think it's interesting that that is entering not just specialist discussions of art historians and practicing artists, but that it's becoming a more public discussion. And I wonder if you encounter that in your teaching with students as well, or if that is perhaps simply not the case.
I mean, certainly when you hear the way how different historians speak about this work, and actually how much material is out there. I mean, for example, as we were mentioning before, lots of folks talk about this as a nostalgia of the end of empire. But then, as we were saying, that this isn't actually set within a scene on the river, that actually would have been very easy to have symbolized all of that. That this is actually set at a different position. This is and cross-sectioning that with his own working class roots, you start to actually have perhaps a different position in relation to that. And that's something that I look at a lot in my own work, is to listen to the accounts of stories or periods of history from different types of historians. And often amateur historians, I think, are often quite interesting in how they present a vernacular approach and a vernacular telling of a story, because it is within those gaps that perhaps we find different types of truths rather than those exact solid ones. And I think perhaps this is also then somehow how Turner plays out his work. He's not one of these artists where the works sit within such one position that is read so directly, and that perhaps his work is able to stand some of those tests and conversations that are taking place right now as a result of that, I think, if that makes sense. I don't know if that does.
When looking at Turner again, and now also with the knowledge that we were going to talk in public about it, did you feel there were any new discovery, any surprises that you didn't expect when last looking at the Turner, that you hadn't noticed, things that resonate with you particularly for your own life, but also for your own practice as an artist at this moment, that you hadn't thought about before?
I mean, my work looks a lot at seafaring. It looks a lot at the mechanisms of empire and how we have been shaped by those mechanisms. And often I look at a lot of what is underpinning the desire for those things. And you know, so for example, I use a lot of naval maps in my work. And that is a way of being able to understand notions like whoever draws, whoever depicts your region, you know, is in effect is in control of the image of how you imagine land and space around you, and how the motivation for something, for example, as detailed but also as beautiful as a naval map, is ultimately commerce. And when I came back to this work, it was something that I found, again, really interesting, that there isn't one position that Turner is taking on here. Because again, you know, there are not singular positions that we can take in relation to the past and how that affects us today. There is a multiplicity, isn't there, of currents, of conversations and dialogues that shape things. And we are continuously in an argument, in a battle, in a conversation that is constantly moving as to where we shift to, from where we are to where we are. Things are always in a flux in that sense. And I kind of, you know, again, coming back to this, the metaphorical sense, the way that the light moves, they all kind of sit within that vein of understanding things as in motion. And
if you were maybe to speak to your students, what are the things that you would encourage them to particularly look at when looking at that painting? What are the things you'd like them to take away from looking at the painting?
I think I often talk about let's describe what we first see. You know, let's not interpret what we see, but let's describe what we see. What are the colors that we see? What are the shapes and forms that we see? And we start to describe that, and we start to talk about what takes place up here as opposed to what takes place down there. How does this part of the painting make us feel as opposed to this part of the painting? What is the language? What is the transition that's taking place? And then once we have loaded that, then we can start to think about what do those things mean? Why are there those transitions in the painting? Why are there those polars? And yeah, why do they work optically? Why are they important in terms of the formality of painting to be able to create things like this ship being in a shadow of blue? You know, that allows us to focus upon it and not just exclusively upon the sunset. The fact that we do have these polars in the painting of an area of very dark and rich color and of almost very precise objectness, but at the top we have an ephemeral space of light and a very trickle of the moon, I think is what he's describing there. But how they create different spaces, and that perhaps also within works we need space to breathe in order to process things as well. So I think there are different notions that we can start to bring in.
And is there something that you feel in your renewed appreciation of the painting, but also your renewed looking at the painting, you feel really makes it relevant today? What is the thing that you think makes Turner relevant today, if anything, for that matter?
Well, as I was saying before, I think it is partly to do with the way that he works with abstraction in his language, but also then how he is talking about, I mean, you know, whereas I'm an artist that often looks at the past in order to understand the present, he is an artist who's very much talking about the present. You know, this is a contemporary story. It was in the newspapers at the time. You know, it was a tabloid story of a sort, and but I think the fact that he takes a slightly elusive position in terms of where of how he feels about the nation and about empire, because he is very proud to be British. He is a nationalist of many sorts, but he's also not glamorizing empire either. And so that is that's quite interesting, and especially when you look at the way that that patronage worked and the way that actually artists operated. So I think in that sense he stands in a strong position.
I found your choice of Turner really inspiring, because to me, to a large degree, Turner is also, well, a utopian artist. Here's somebody who is painting, yes, the ship being brought, the Temeraire being brought to the breaker's yard, but there's a future that we're looking at. There's the steamship. It's coming towards us. We are part of this as beholder. We are witnessing this moment. We're experiencing it, but there's also the real unusual for the time treatment of the paint, the pigment, the canvas in a way that's new, that's novel, that's exciting, that opens up literally new horizons. And the way they're being opened up is through, in the end, the hand and the craftsmanship and the operation, the practice of the painter, of the artist. That is a certain transcendentalist notion that might seem conservative to us now, but at the time, with this style on which he paints and which he treats the pigment and makes his role as an artist visible in the treatment of the paint, I think that's actually quite unusual, quite inspiring, and again, at the time, quite utopia.
Yeah, amazing.
Well, with that, maybe can I ask you to join me in thanking Shiraz Bayjoo for this overview, and thank you very much for joining us here at the National Gallery. Thank you.
If you'd like to know more about my work, click on the link in the description, and thank you for watching.